Hi, good evening, everyone. Once again, NXP, came up with a very innovative topic, is boot ROM, and as you guys aware of, in every embedded systems, the heart of the system is processor or the microcontroller, and when we power on any electronic equipments, the process starts with the reset, clocking, and then the initialization of the system, and after then the major task is going to be started. Means the transfer is going to be given to applications. So this is the brief summary of today's topic, and you guys are very much aware of. On first Tuesday, we are giving lecture on the VLSI track, and on third Tuesday, we are sharing our thoughts on the system engineering side. And today's topic is boot ROM system design and architecture of boot ROM within the SOC framework. So with this brief introduction of the topic, I will introduce today's speaker, Mr. Rishabh Kumar Goyal, who is our chief architect as well as chief mentor, who is involved in this domain almost 10 plus years of experience, and his total industry experience is close to 19 plus years. He will sail through the what boot ROM is, what is the real use cases, and how this is part of the complete ECU, which is electronic control units. So over to Rishabh. Rishabh, welcome. We have audience from different.
Welcome everybody. So today's topic is boot ROM design and architecture. As Manish pointed out, microprocessor is a heart of any embedded system. Okay, let's just start with any embedded system. So if you look at it from today's world, you are surrounded with embedded systems all around you. Like you have your mobile phones, which is a classic example of an embedded system. You have your refrigerators, you have your washing machines, you have your televisions. All these are in a way kind of embedded systems. And needless to say, you have IoTs, right? With Amazon Echo Dot and Alexa kind of devices. All these are examples of your embedded system. And the heart of the system is a microprocessor, which is running these applications, your IoT applications or other applications. And today's talk will focus on the boot ROM part. Now, you may be wondering what a boot ROM is, right? So I am sure you guys are pretty much familiar with the concept of bootstrapping, right? So when we work in colleges, we work on different microcontrollers, and what we do, right? The first thing that we do is power it up. The moment we power it up, your code, like if you are working on Cortex M kind of series, you know that your processor will start working from 0x0, from where it is going to fetch your program counter for execution, right? So a boot ROM is an embedded firmware or a software which is present inside your microcontroller which handles all your system initialization, right? And once it has initialized your system, it will transfer control to your application which you are developing for the system. So if you look at it from the process perspective, it becomes you power up the device, your supply voltages will ramp. Okay, just one information. So this session is a recorded session. I hope it will be acceptable to all. Okay, so where I was. So When you power up a system, so what happens? Your supplies ramp up, they will reach to a certain level, and then your power management IC comes into play and it will deassert the CPU reset. What we mean by deasserting CPU resetted, it will bring your CPU out of reset so that it can start functioning. The moment CPU reset is deasserted, this CPU, which is the heart of your embedded system, directly jumps to a power on reset, and then it will start executing the boot ROM code. Now, today's talk will primarily be centered around this boot ROM, what we do in boot ROM, what are different modes of boot ROM, and then what are different flavors of boot ROM which are required by today's next generation embedded systems. Okay, so with this, I, Rishabh Goyal, I'm here to present you the boot ROM design architecture. So I work as a principal lead engineer with Automotive Engineering Solutions Group at NXP India. So the agenda will primarily comprise of a high-level view of boot ROM, how the boot ROM, the basics of SOC booting, what are different functionalities, architecture, and then we will delve into a bit about how what are the process flows that goes through boot ROM design, validation, verification, and tools that we use to make sure that the boot ROMs that we develop for our SoCs are perfect and they come out with zero defects. And finally, we'll conclude and then have a Q&A session with all of you guys. Okay. So with this, I'll move to the first topic, which is, let's say, what is the system on chip view? So what you see here on the slide is a typical architecture of an SoC internals. What you see here is okay. So what you see on a typical processor, you have these processor buses, internal buses, which are meant to carry your data and addresses to different parts of your processor. You have your various CPUs, which do all the bulk processing. So these are where your applications actually run. You have various accelerators that are built into an SoC. The prime job of these accelerators is to execute specific tasks quickly so that you get better performance from the device. These are all supported by your memory. So you have DDR, LPDDR. So these are your volatile memories. Then you have your non-volatile memory. So if you look at your mobile phone, for example, they are typically shipped with an eMMC or an MMC card on the board, right? Similarly, if you a bit older devices, you will have devices with NAND ECC, NAND controllers. So they will have MLC NANDs built onto the board so that they can give you, they provide you the non-volatile storage. Similarly, you have SRAM controllers to handle runtime data. Since we are talking about SoC, and SoC is not complete unless it contains a lot of other peripherals so that you can reduce chips that are required on the board. So you have watchdog timers, interrupt controllers, DMA controllers, power management controllers, and real-time clocks. So these are system level peripherals which are which are kind of integrated with typically all SoCs that you see in the market. You may have optional display controllers to control your LCDs. You may have primary and secondary. If you want to relate from primary and secondary, you can think about flip phones that we had some time back in the past, where you have primary display, which is the bigger screen inside the phone, and you have a smaller TFT display on the front of the phone. So the secondary display controller, you get notifications, and your primary display controllers, you're actually running your main operating systems on your phones. Similarly, you may have a video input interfaces. So these are typically used, to give you an example, these are for your, let's say, for your televisions and all. You will have video input interfaces where you are streaming data, video data into the device, like a camera, for example. Then there are other peripherals like I2S, AC97. These are typically used for your audio application, the SPDIF. You have MPEG TS parser. So these are specialized peripherals to pass your MPEG data stream that you get from set-top boxes. So overall, if you look at it, a typical SoC contains all these components. And what you see in the middle, right, a small device, 20 KB ROM and a small 64 KB ROM marked as boot ROM. So in this big SoC, you have a very small component called boot ROM, but the most critical component, because this is the guy which is responsible for booting your application on this device. So this small 20 KB Wonder is the key between your device for your application getting started on the device. Okay. Now here, what I just want to show you is a typical ECU board. Now this is an NXP reference board that was designed for one of our processors. You look here, a lot of these peripheral connectors, right? So in the center, this is where our processor is. So it's sitting inside this heatsink. You have your USB connectors, you have CAN interfaces, eMMC, SD slot, micro SD slot, and this is an eMMC slot in the behind. You have your Ethernet connectors here. Then you go to this side, you have something like in Archon selections. These are dip switches which are typically meant to provide input to your boot ROM, what to boot and where to boot from. Similarly, you have your USB connectors which can be used for any USB type of an application, and in fact we use them for booting as well. Other than that, important components may be a reset switch or an NMI switch. You have a serial NOR here which can be used to boot your device from a NOR flash. Okay, so this is a typical embedded system. So depending on the complexity of the system you may have certain peripherals on board, or you may not have them for that particular system. So it typically depends on the use cases for which that embedded system is defined. Okay, and similarly you define the inputs to boot from, okay, what to boot and what not to boot from. So as I mentioned 2 slides back, a boot ROM is a small piece of hardware which is inside the chip. So here what you see is a typical CPU diagram. What you see here is the switch fabric where you contain the internal processor bus, and you see a boot ROM sitting here on this bus. You have internal SRAMs here, and this is the core where the boot ROM is supposed to execute. Apart from that, you have multiple peripherals like Quad SPI, NAND, etc., etc. So boot ROM, in a way, is a software which is inside the chip, and is practically communicating with all the system modules inside your processor to get the application from the external memory or an internal memory, and then making them to work. Okay, so if you look at it from here, you have Quad SPI or NAND, and these are, let's say, these are by boot peripherals. They contain your images for booting. Okay. Now we'll talk about a boot definition, which is what happens and how the booting occurs. So we have touched upon it a bit in the beginning. So the moment in an automotive environment, the moment you power up your ignition, right? When you switch on your ignition, the supply voltages ramp up in the system. The moment they reach a critical level, your power management IC, it releases the reset of the device. The device, the moment a reset is released, it starts its internal processing. Now, when we talk about reset processing, it means device is going to load load the configuration into the hardware registers. Now, for example, if you have a flat fuse based device, at the time of reset processing, the device is going to load all the fuse settings and set up the hardware so for the core to start executing the applications. So once your reset processing is complete, the reset to the core, the booting core, is deasserted, and the core will start fetching the instructions from the boot ROM. Now, from this stage onwards, boot ROM will read different peripherals to identify what to boot and where to boot and how to boot. So these are three important questions that boot ROM works with, and these questions are answered during the reset processing by loading different values into different registers into the system. So boot ROM takes these inputs from hardware registers, initializes system memory, initializes the clocks required for booting, initialize the external peripheral from which the application has to be read from. It will read the application, put that into the memory where it is supposed to reside, and then transfer the control to the application to start executing from. So boot ROM is the first core which is started by your processor after the resets are deasserted. Once the boot ROM work is over, once the application is loaded, boot ROM transfers the control to your application code, and that is where the job of boot ROM primarily ends. Okay, from this point your application code takes control, and for example, typically in an automotive world, the first thing that the automotive application codes do is they set up their CAN environment for the CAN communication on the vehicle bus to succeed. So they set up the CAN peripheral and CAN settings of the on the device and initiate your CAN communication. This is typically important because if in a certain time CAN communications are not acknowledged, the system treats the device as non-existent. Okay. Now, so how does a system boot up? CPU will down. So if you look at it from the way applications are divided. Okay, so you have a CPU with boot ROM. The boot ROM's prime responsibility is to load the first stage bootloader. So if you look at your mobile phone, I'll give a mobile phone as an example here. So if you do power down and volume down and power button and reboot your mobile phone, it will typically go into a bootloader, right? The factory bootloader modes, right? So those are the bootloader of a mobile phone. Okay, so what happens in a mobile phone also? You have an internal ROM which loads the bootloader, and then the bootloader comes into play. Bootloader identifies what needs to be done. Do I have to load the operating system, or do I have to install a new firmware into the system, etc., etc. So typically from the process perspective, CPU will download bootloader from the interface, then and put that into the RAM. Bootloader will then set up your DRAM, etc., the external DDR memories and all, configures different peripherals required by the main application, which is your operating system. Now here this operating system can be Linux, Android, FreeRTOS, any embedded microsystem, AutoSAR based system. So it can be any operating system here at this point in time. So bootloader's prime responsibility is to set up the environment for the operating system or the application to execute. Okay. Now, as things started becoming complex, right? So typically, if you look at old era boot ROMs or bootloaders, there was not much of a concept of security. That is, you have a boot ROM whose job is typically to just get the application and put it to execute. It does not used to care whether this application is the application that it is supposed to execute. So as hacking became more prevalent, boot ROMs also evolved with time, and they started working out with respect to that, okay, if I have to boot this application, is this application the real application which I am supposed to boot? So there comes the concept of security in boot ROM. So another flavor of boot ROM is boot a secured software or an authentic software in the system. When we configure boot ROM to work as a secure boot, we say the boot ROM process flow basically adds a small component inside it, which is loading up of security firmware inside the system. So what boot ROM does is boot ROM will first load your security firmware, gets your application software authenticated by the security firmware, and then put that application software into execution. So this way, you are always sure that the application which is running on this system is an authentic or an original application which is meant to be executed and not a hack device. Okay. Now here there's another example of a typical multi-core systems that happens, and this is typically what happens on systems where you have a wide variety of cores. So you have your boot ROM that starts up. It performs. So we are now talking about a next generation boot ROMs or typical automotive boot ROMs here, where when they boot, they execute a self-test. So automotive devices, they come with another constraint or a requirement that whatever we are running on the device, we first have to ensure that this device is proper. This device does not carry any hardware defects. To meet those requirements in automotive devices, we have a concept of self-test. So during self-test, the hardware checks itself for any hardware flaws that is present in the system at that point in time. So these flaws can come up because these are automotive applications. They are meant to last 10 years and beyond. There can be a possibility that a flaw could have occurred into the system. So for the application to know whether there is a fault in the device that has occurred, the boot ROM initiates a self-test on the device. This self-test tests the hardware and keeps the result of this test stored for the application to analyze. Okay. Once the self-test is completed, an internal reset is again issued to the device, and then booting process restarts, which is depicted by an init2 process of a boot ROM. And this init2 process now loads your primary or the first stage bootloader. Okay. So With the init1 and self-test, what we are doing is we are setting up the system for testing. We test the system and cores reset. Once the cores are reset, we load the application bootloader, and these application bootloaders which are loaded, once loaded, they are the control is transferred to the first application core. Now this is the place where your practically your U-boot is executing. Now U-boot again will have certain initialization phases, and in case you have multiple cores that are to be executed or booted into your system, bootloader will load second stage bootloaders for the secondary or the tertiary cores beyond, and then transfer controls to those cores, or basically release reset to those cores for the core 2 or core 3s beyond to execute, while U-boot is loading code into the system for the rich OS or the primary RTOS to execute. Okay, so so if you look at it from a U-boot perspective, you will have an init phase followed by loading of core 2 bootloader, and then loading up of your application or the RTOSes and put your RTOS in execution, while your secondary cores like core 2 will be performing their own initialization and then execution of your rich OSs. So if we just divide these three, we can say we have a booting core, which is executing your boot ROM. This is typically a safety core which runs on the system. Your core 1 is basically a microcontroller core or a real-time processing core, and your core 2 or the core 2 clusters are basically your Cortex A53s, which are running your rich OSs like Linux or Android, etc. Okay. Now let's look at the boot ROM evolution. So as I mentioned earlier, boot ROMs typically started with just a simple job of getting application to boot. Then came debug access restrictions, like, okay, while we are booting, we will not allow debuggers to connect to. Then came the concept of device lifecycle. So what this typically means is a typical automotive device has a certain life cycle in place. So we define in NXP like the life cycle in which we are giving the device to the first tier 1 customer. It is known as customer delivery life cycle. When tier 1 customer prepares an ECU, it is going to advance this life cycle into OEM production. This is where your automotive vendors like Tata or Jaguar or other companies like that, they will receive the ECUs in this life cycle. And once it goes into your car and actually comes to your house, it is not in OEM production, but in in-field life cycle. With these different life cycles, different functionalities of the devices are controlled. For example, I will say that when I am giving my device to a tier 1, all the debuggers are open in this device. When the device is going in field, all the debuggers are closed. Nobody can connect a debugger to this device unless it is a secure debugger. After the device lifecycle scheme came the concept of cryptography and secure boot. So with the initial scheme or device lifecycle, then the boot ROM became more complex and was supposed to make sure that we are always booting an authenticated application. So came the concept of, okay, let's bring in cryptography into boot ROM and then start providing the secure boot to the devices. Following the secure boot, the natural progression was provide support for over-the-air upgrades. Now, what do we mean by over-the-air upgrades? You have a mobile phone, you download data you download your firmware upgrade from the mobile server, from your OEM servers, and then you put that into execution while your older firmware is revoked, right? So BootROM also has evolved with time to start supporting over-the-air upgrades as well. Now here, when we start talking about cryptography and secure boot, we also say that BootROM is the first component that forms the root of chain of trust. We will delve into this root of chain of trust a bit later during the talk. Now let's look at a Virgin ECU programming or a flashing support. Now typically, if you look at it, if I am looking at from the NXP perspective, when NXP manufactures an ECU, it does not carry any application, right? So the first question is, how do you bring in application into the device, right? So a BootROM also has features to let user or a tier 1 download application into the device. This particular feature, we call it as the serial boot protocol. One of the prime objectives of a serial boot protocol is to provide a really very low cost implementation to our customers, so that they need not have to procure do special arrangements for booting or programming the device. One of the cases that can be made is, hey, I can connect a reset I can connect a debugger to my ECU and program the flash, no big deal. But then if you are to connect a debugger on a production line, you are actually wasting time and you're putting in extra money into the production line. So we say we have serial boot protocol where you can bring in your code through a LIN or a CAN interface, which is already present in your device, to bring in your code and program that into the system. So effectively, what we are saying is, the serial boot mode of a BootROM is typically targeted towards production line programming. The BootROM we develop provide multiple serial interfaces like UART, CAN, and Ethernet to download your program on the production line onto the device. Now let's talk about the over-the-air upgrade. So as I mentioned, right, just to relate what an OTA upgrade will be. So you have your mobile phone, you click on, in an Android phone, you typically say, okay, is software update available? System will go to your OEM servers and check, do I have a firmware upgrade? If yes, download that firmware update, trigger my bootloader to update that firmware, and I have my firmware update going up and ready, right? So similarly, if you look at it from an automotive perspective, so from an automotive perspective, you have a gateway device onto the system, right? So a gateway device is a main controller in the system, which is communicating with the external world via telematics unit. So gateway is also responsible to check what all software or versions of softwares are running on different ECUs on this connected in the car bus network. So what happens is, when a software upgrade check is triggered, gateway gets all this information, okay, which version of software we are running. It will connect to its OEM over the air cloud servers, get the information of if there is a software update available for these ECUs which are connected in my car. Let's say, for an example, you have an ECU-C for which a new version of software is available. Gateway is now going to trigger firmware upgrade for the ECU-C. Now, hey, all this what we are talking about, where does BootROM come into play? It's all an applications play game here, right? Now, what happens while you are downloading this ECUC and you're programming this ECUC, something happens in the system and there's a reset to this ECUC. If you have overwritten your existing image, it may so happen that this device may stop responding to your CAN networks or to your CAN commands with which you are communicating with your gateway, right? So if this device has boot ROM with over-the-air support, the boot ROM running on this ECUC will detect that this device is not able to boot, or boot ROM is not able to boot this application securely. It will switch this ECU from the primary application to a secondary application, effectively saying that your system gets auto restored to a factory default. After which the system becomes responsive again to the OTA manager commands, and then this system is going to can restart the firmware update call for this particular ECUC. I hope this is clear to everybody. So what do we? What are we? What are the main points with what we take into account? Boot ROM is not auto upgradable. Boot ROM is not auto upgradable because boot ROM is present on a ROM inside the chip. Okay, customer applications are auto upgradable, right? And typically, what it will include, it means is you erase the existing image, program a new image for the device to boot next time. As I mentioned earlier, right, a typical OTA failure reasons could be that while you are erasing or reprogramming, there's a reset or some fault that occurred in your system and your system is not able to boot, right? Or the image that you're trying to program is buggy and it's not able to respond. So boot ROM typically supports handling both these cases, in a sense that if the application is not able to boot properly, it will be able to switch from a primary application to a backup image so that the firmware update can be re-triggered for this particular device. Okay. Now we'll talk about a bit about security, right? I mentioned about boot ROM progressing from non-secure application booting to a secure boot. Now, when we talk about secure boot, there's the very first thing that comes into play is where is your root of chain of trust? Now, what do we mean by root of chain of trust? Root of chain of trust typically means that this particular software or the device is the starting point for the chain of trust. So when we talk about chain of trust means I trust boot ROM trusts U-boot trusts Linux or an Android, and so Android can be trusted. Okay, so it is the chain of trust. I trust you, you trust me, and so we all are trusted, right? So boot ROM, since it resides inside the SOC, it's the first software which is running on the device, so it forms the root of chain of trust for the system to boot. Therefore, when we have to execute a secure boot, we say, okay, let's what do? We say, okay, to boot, we need to know from where to boot. Let's authenticate the image vector table. An image vector table typically contains which application core to boot, where to transfer control after loading the application, what is the size of application that we are downloading, and is all this data is it authenticated or is it authentic or not? So the first thing that the boot ROM typically will do is it will download image vector table from the external memory and authenticate whether this vector table can be trusted or not. Once vector table is trust is authenticated, the second thing that comes into play is I have downloaded an application from an external device. Now, is this application right, or is this application correct or not, right? So the second thing that we do is we now authenticate this application. Now, authentication of an application can mean two things. A, whether the data integrity of this application is correct or not. B, is it coming from the right source or not? Okay, so boot ROM, what it can do, it will A, authenticate the application with respect to data integrity as well as with respect to your source. So this is where cryptography plays a major role. To prove a data integrity of an application, you calculate the hash of the application that you are downloading and compare that hash with what you have downloaded. So you download an application from an external source, external non-volatile source into your RAM, then you compute the hash of it and check whether this hash is what is mentioned on the system. Now, this is just to ensure that your data integrity is right. The second part is whether it is coming from a right source or not. When boot ROM implement these kinds of cryptography, these kinds of authentication, it typically goes in for something like an asymmetric cryptography, where for the application that I am downloading, I am also storing the signature of this application. Okay, now a signature can be an RSA or an ECC based. Okay, so what boot ROM will do is it will download the application, compute the signature based upon the public key of the public key stored inside the device, and then it authenticates whether the signature that is present is right for that public key or not. So these are the basic application authentications that are carried out inside the boot ROM before it passes control back to the application. And it's not just that. So it also put up access restrictions on the system. Like, for example, I have my cryptographic accelerator into the system. So when an application I'm downloading, what all memory regions can this application access? So all those parameters are configured by the boot ROM, whether you can access a debugger on this application or not. If you are accessing a debugger, whether the debugger is going to be a challenge response based or a password based mechanism. So the system is going to, the boot ROM is going to set up your debug authentication protocols and then the values according to that in the hardware IP registers. Similarly, it is going to make sure that the right accesses are provided to the application. So your application is not able to access things which it is not supposed to do. In some of the devices, we also say that the application owner decides what this application can access, and then you do something like transposing of system restrictions along with your application restrictions, and then you provide the common restrictions to the application for them to execute. Okay, so here comes the root of chain of trust for customer and the silicon. So we have touched a quite good detail about what we do in secure booting, right? So security is typically based upon three pillars. A is data integrity, B, data confidentiality, and C is availability of resource. Data integrity, as I mentioned, is primarily based on hashes on the device, right? So if you're, and the hashes that we use are all one-way hashes. So for any code that you have, it will always have a unique hash. So if I have a 1 byte code, it will have its unique hash. If I have a 1000 byte code, it will have a unique hash. Any combination inside that 1000 byte will also have its unique hash. So authentication is based upon ensuring that the data integrity is maintained. We also have to ensure confidentiality. Now, when we talk about confidentiality, we are talking about encryption. There are certain data which we do not want user to see, right? So those data is maintained encrypted. Like for example, we have security firmware, and obviously no security vendor is going to say, hey, this is my code, please use it as what you want to use, right? They will always say, this is my code and this is encrypted by this key. You can use it only in an encrypted form. You should have a mechanism to load this encrypted binary into your system so that nobody is able to see what is loaded inside the system. So this is one of the examples of where we talk about encryption of the data. This is also true with respect to a third party vendor which is developing some proprietary algorithms, right? That application owner or that library owner can say, hey, you can use this, but you have to make sure that it is not seen by anybody else. So I am only going to give you an encrypted binary and it can be executed only on this processor, okay, if it has this key and it is not seen by anybody else, right? So this is where you have encryption and access control comes into play, playing the part of confidentiality. Third is availability. When we talk about availability, we say, okay, in this processor, these are the regions which are allowed for you to access. These are regions which are not allowed for you to access. So what we do is when we are doing a secure boot, we say we are creating an isolation between a non-trusted world and a trusted world in the system. Similarly, secure coding for handling. So Bootstrap implements secure coding guidelines to handle side channel and logical attacks. The objective here is to make sure that the boot ROM is robust enough that it is able to, it is not leaking any of the critical information in the system out through side channel. A side channel can typically mean by means of your current consumption of the system. It can even mean with respect to noise generated on the system, right? So these are some of the side channels with which you are not leaking information in clear form, but your information is getting leaked from the system just because you are accessing this information. So, and then you have logical attacks on the system. Logical attacks by mean somebody gives you a malified code, and if you have not implemented your checks properly, you are able to get into the system where you are not supposed to enter, right? To prevent these attacks, to prevent logical attacks, lot of isolations are done inside Bootstrap, like MPU, programming the memory protection unit for access controls, reading and storing critical decision input makings multiple times, checking the decision makings multiple times, uh, checking for different address ranges, valid address ranges or invalid address ranges, and other various countermeasures to make sure that if somebody is trying to hack your system, it is not, let's say for example, I need to do a secure boot, but hey, if somebody just bypasses a secure boot, am I in Bootstrap able to detect that I am supposed to do a secure boot, but my secure boot itself has been bypassed, right? So these types of countermeasures are implemented into the system to make sure that the system is robust and side channel and attack proven. One of the underlying statements here is most of the security vulnerabilities are typically caused by design or implementation weaknesses. Okay. Now we talk about trust provisioning and reduction of attack surface. So let me give you a brief background. So a typical high-end processors typically generally contains lot of keys which are programmed into the device. And when we talk about cryptography, we say algorithm is known to everybody, but it is the key which is the key factor here. If you know the key, cryptography is open. If you don't know the key, even if information is available to you in front of you, it is useless for you because you can't understand it or you can't read it, right? So we say that the keys are very critical into the system, and at NXP, we don't trust anybody with respect to keys. We don't trust the boot ROM guys. We don't trust the shop floor where the chip is manufactured. We basically do not trust anybody, not the person who is working on our production floor, and also not the machines that are being used for programming. So typically, our devices, they go through a process called trust provisioning, where, so let me just give you a brief about what trust provisioning here we are talking about. So here what you see is a tester machine. So it's a big machine that we have where your devices, after packaging the black chips that we get, right? So they are placed inside this particular machine, and there they are programmed. So while they are programming, you can have a hacker controlling a test program here, and he can see what is getting programmed here, right? So when we are programming keys into our devices, what we say is, okay, where or what all are the points from where the key, the key can be leaked, or can somebody has an access to this key. It can be, I created a secure machine from where I'm generating the keys, but a key can be, and from this machine the key is getting transmitted to your tester. There is a possibility that while this key is being transferred from the HSM machine which is generating the key to the tester, and this key, and somebody is snooping here. While it is snooping, it can actually get access to the key. So hey, first thing, make sure that this access is secured. So it can be through a VPN tunnel. Number two, once this data comes in here, it may be in the hands of a tester. So even though you have secured this channel, the person who is working on this tester has the access to all the data that has come from this HSM machine. So that is another area where the data can be taken out. Another attack surface that we can say is, hey, what if somebody impersonated this machine itself? Because at the end of the day, it's all internet accesses, right? If somebody spoofs and masquerades himself or herself as a tester machine, then he may get an access to it. So at NXP, we have defined a way in which none of these attack surfaces have clear access to the keys of the device. So the keys are transmitted over secure channel in an encrypted way to be decoded inside the chip and then programmed in a different encrypted mechanism unique to a device. So that way, and all these work of trust provisioning are also performed by the boot ROM, because at this point in time on your device, it is only boot ROM which is available to you. So trust provisioning for secure devices is an important work or the important job for the boot ROM to execute. Now let's come to what all peripherals does the boot ROM supports and how they actually work, right? So if you look at it from the software layer perspective, you have boot as a module, which is basically the boot ROM. It comprises of boot middleware. Boot middleware is where the logic for implementing what to do in boot ROM comes in. Uh, what to do and how to do it is implemented inside boot ROM. The middleware takes help of boot interface drivers. You may have different types of drivers like block devices, serial devices, or execute in place kind of devices. By block devices, I typically mean you may have a NAND flash on your system or an STMMC or an eMMC device on your system. A typical serial interface will mean you have a CAN, UART, USB, SPI interface, that is serial peripheral interface, I2C, and Ethernet. All these are different peripherals which are serial in nature. Then we have a flash, then we have execute in place type of devices like your NOR flashes or a typical quad SPI. Just to give you a bit about and not to confuse you, QSPI means a quad SPI. A quad SPI is like a serial peripheral interface or an SPI device having 4 I/O channels. A typical SPI will have your MOSI and MISO line. A quad will have 4 I/O channels. And similarly, we now have octal flashes into market where you have 8 I/O channels. So a SPI will have bandwidth, let's say X Mbps bandwidth. A quad will have 4x bandwidth, and then octal will have an 8x bandwidth. Okay, so these are different boot interface drivers which are supported in our boot ROMs to make sure that to provide a variety of options for our system, the system designers to design the system boot. Typical boot modes, if we talk about, we have test modes, we have trust provisioning modes, as we talked earlier, and then you have secure boot modes. So we'll now delve a bit into the different mechanism, how boot ROM knows what to do and how is answered by boot middleware. What to do is what is answered by during the reset phase of the architecture, and how boot ROM comes to know about them. Okay, so we'll talk about the features, targets, interfaces, and modes here. So first we'll talk about boot modes. So you have a trust provisioning mode, you have boot from fuses, boot from Archon, serial boot, and then test modes. Trust provisioning, we've already discussed about it. So the job of trust provisioning is to make sure that you are able to securely program keys into your devices. Boot device from fuses is a typical use case where we program whether the device is to boot from quad SPI, NAND, or whatever. So these programming informations are programmed inside the fuse, and fuses are one-time programmable. So when you are going from a development device to a production device, you have already finalized that, okay, this particular ECU is going to boot from this interface, and these are the different properties of this interface that needs to be configured for it to boot. And those configuration informations are stored inside the fuses for the boot ROM to make use of them. It also plays an important role with respect to security, that nobody, once programmed on fuses, no, it cannot be changed, and nobody can tinker with them on the in the field device. Then for the development devices, for you guys to develop your boot codes and application codes, Bootrom also provides different a parallel mode called an Archon or a serial Archon mode. So typically, whatever configuration that you are programming into your fuses are programmed into your EEPROM. So while you are designing your system, you can take into account, okay, I am trying to boot from quad SPI at such and such frequency. So to configure that, I need to tinker out, okay, let me try at this delay, let me try at Y delay, or let me try at X frequency, and then let me go for Y frequency. So all these types of testing or all these types of configurations, which typically go into play while you are developing your device, you can handle them through an Archon on a serial Archon mode. Then we have a serial board. Typically, this is meant for your production line where you can download your data from CAN, USB, UART, etc. These or Ethernet interfaces, and then let that program the main application onto the device. Also, we have certain test modes that help with manufacturing. So these are test modes which help to execute different tests on the production line within the NXP to make sure that the chip is functioning properly before it is shipped out or it is quality passed. Now we'll talk about, so these boot modes come into the device either via bootstrap pins or they come through a fuse cell selections and are coupled with life cycle. Okay, so these are the three important items on the device configurations which are loaded into the system during the reset cycle, which act as an input, first stage input for the Bootrom to work with. Now let's talk about boot interfaces. Now I already mentioned that Bootrom specify or lets you boot the device from different interfaces, right? Now a NAND flash, quad SPI flash, all these different devices have different types of settings. For example, just to give a very basic example, I have a NAND flash which has 2K of page size. Some other vendor will say I have a NAND flash for 1K page size. I have a NAND flash for 512 bytes of page sizes, right? Or a 4K page size. Bootrom, since it is generic in nature, need to know these information about the device which you're booting. Similarly, let's talk about SD, MMC. So SD and MMC again has different configurations. Like, for example, SD typically will say I support 1-bit or a 4-bit mode. MMC says I can support 1-bit, 4-bit or 8-bit. But a Bootrom need to know whether the board or the device that you have manufactured, is it configured for 1-bit, 4-bit or an 8-bit mode, right? So these are different types of settings that the Bootrom takes as an input through an Archon or a serial Archon or from the fuses. Typical use of fuse is for an in-field device, which is so that these configurations are finalized and they will not change during the life cycle of the device. Once we have, so what we have done so far, we have identified, okay, the device has to boot in X mode. The device has to bring data from this interface. But hey, now the question is, what to boot? Now, if I have a system where I have multiple cores, Bootrom needs to know which core you want to boot, where the data is, how much data is, whether it is authenticated or not, right? So all these information is present in a table called image vector data or an image vector configuration data. So we have an image vector table which contain all these informations. Most importantly, who is my boot target, whether it is a Cortex M core, whether it is a Cortex A core, whether it is an R core, depending on which processor we are this boot ROM is working upon, right? So it tells you about who is the target core. So once this image is loaded at the right place, authenticated in case if it is a secure boot, then which core to ungate to start executing an application, right? So it cannot happen that I have an application which is meant to execute on Cortex M core and I'm giving that application to a PowerPC core. If that happens, the system is not going to boot because these two are not related, right? So your image vector table is an important entity in the boot process, which provides you what to boot, where to get your data from, how much to get your data from, whether it is to be what is the authentication information regarding that data, and so on and so forth. Okay, so with this we'll talk about, so with this I've tried to cover a boot ROM at a very high level with respect to the design and what goes on in the boot ROM. Now let's talk about the development cycle of the boot ROM. As you can see from the figure here, boot ROM, even though it's a very small component in the SoC, but it cannot function without the support of so many different teams in an organization, right? So how the cycle works is, the moment we start with a new product introduction or we define a new chip, we say, okay, these are our boot requirements. When these requirements are captured, then the boot ROM team comes into play. It talks to the hardware design team. It talks to the system team with respect to what all different use cases are there, so that the boot ROM can be tinkered with and it is tailor-made for every SoC to make sure that it supports all the use cases that are required for boot ROM for that particular device. It works with, we work with the soft verification or the soft SoC verification team, because boot ROM, hey, it's being a ROM component, so it needs to be available on the system before the silicon is taped out. By the way, a tape out means, so let's say, for example, you do a programming in your in your computer science classes, right? So what you do is you write your program and you test, okay, it is running fine. This program is running on your Cortex ARM cores or whatever embedded device that you guys are using in your college, right? Now, boot ROM is supposed to run on a processor which does not even exist, right? So the team develops the code in conjunction with various teams like your IP team, systems team, and then once this code is written, it is tested in a verification environment. So what we do is we model the SoC in verification, we run our boot ROM code with the verification to see whether it is working the way it is expected to work. Once the boot ROM is verified, the chip is taped out, it goes into the validation stage. So validation typically means now the silicon is up, let's see what you have done. So is the boot ROM and the device both working the way they were expected to work during verification? So verification happens pre-tape out, validation happens post tape out once the samples are available on your table. Okay. Now, primary job of boot ROM is to boot an application. So, hey, apps are a logical customer to the boot ROM. Since boot ROM is implementing security, so it interacts with the security team, A, with respect to the security definition for the chip, B, with respect to what needs to be implemented, what level of security needs to be implemented within boot ROM for that device. Documentation team, obviously, because whatever boot ROM has done, it is the first code that the customer is going to write for that device, right? So it has to be documented properly. Bootstrap team interacts with test engineering. TEP here refers to test and product engineering team. So all the trust provisioning that we discussed earlier are all happening via these teams. Then we have tools team, which is developing software to develop for your applications, right? So these tools team develops small components which are integrated into bigger softwares that so they need to be so a lot of discussion that goes with the tools team. Okay, for this device, these are the vector table structures. This is how they need to be configured. For this kind of use case scenario, these are the different options that you need to take care. And so similarly with the software team, because they are writing applications and softwares on top of Bootstrap. And needless to say, a PMO who works as a sheet anchor for the Bootstrap and integration with the wider SOC schedules. Now, since we have just talked about what all different teams we work with, let's just talk about the development flow. So the typical Bootstrap development flow gets kicked off from the NPI kickoff itself, where the requirements are defined in this tool. Based upon these requirements, architecture definition and verification and validation strategies, pre-silicon validation strategies are defined. You go through the design and implementation phase. You go through a static analysis phase where you run LDRA or a Coverity kind of Coverity systems to make sure that there are no issues in your coding or implementation. Parallelly, the validation or the verification team creates test bench and pre-silicon test setups for the Bootstrap to be tested. All these test benches and the test cases, they come together and we perform a unit and a system level testing at the pre-silicon level to make sure that Bootstrap is behaving the way it is supposed to behave. Finally, we go through a process of sign-off review, and once the sign-offs are achieved, the ROM memory is ordered for the device and a silicon is taped out. In a nutshell, a Bootstrap is all about security, performance, and footprint. Why performance? Because we are making sure that we are able to boot your application as fast as possible to reduce your response time, because nobody likes if my phone takes 10 seconds to boot, right? Footprint, because we have to make sure that the size of Bootstrap is as small as possible, because larger the footprint, more is the cost of Bootstrap per device. And security, it's a sheet anchor. I think there's no debate on that. Now, what are the goals in Bootstrap design? So we'll talk about goals with respect to objective is to make sure that it's a highly functional, optimized firmware which meets all the functional requirement, performance targets, and the security goals defined for that chip. How is it achieved, or what is done to make sure that this goal is achieved? It goes through a process of architectural definition, documentation, designs, make sure that the designs are bug-free, which involves discussions and handshakes with different teams across the organization, and these requirements are then converted into your C assembly or C or an assembly code, which is then converted into a binary form, and then it goes out onto the silicon. How it is done? So typically, as I said, Bootstrap is tailor-made for every silicon. So it's mainly a manual process with respect to architecture definition, interfaces, accesses, and programming. So all these are manually defined with respect to the architectures and all. We developed our own libraries, so those libraries help us make sure that we have a lot of functional code already available for those IPs. In case there are changes in the IPs, then those have to be again hand coded and written into the bootrom for that particular SOC. Output that we generate is a bootrom binary. It is modular, scalable, and parameterized design. Modular, scalable, parameterized in a way, how it comes into place, we have for one device, there are multiple phantoms that we come out. So if the parameters are defined correctly, the bootrom adjusts itself for that particular SOC to be able to take care about different phantoms that are coming out from that device. The prime goal, zero defect, first time right. It is very important here, the bootrom has to have zero defect, because change in bootrom means a silicon has to be retaped out. So one of the prime responsibility for this team is to make sure that the designs are proper, so that the respinning of designs, we can avoid tape outs. And at every tape out means millions of dollars of expenditure for the company. Now we'll talk about the bootrom validation strategy. The first goal is make sure that the bootrom is bug free. The reasons are obvious. To make sure that the bootrom is bug free, test strategies are defined at pre-silicon and post-silicon. Traceabilities with respect to requirements are carried out, just to make sure that no requirement is missed while the development, and if they are missed, they are caught at the right time, at the appropriate time. Test vectors and test specifications are prepared based upon the requirements. The testing is then carried out across multiple platforms, be it inside simulation or hardware emulation. Once the chip is taped out, all the testing of bootrom is carried out on the device to make sure what we have designed is what we have delivered for the SOC. Right? Output for a validation is code coverage and product test report. Code coverage typically means that we are ensuring that 100% of the code is getting covered during our testing, right? And the product test report is a testament that yes, all the testing has been carried out. The primary goal for a validation strategy is make sure that zero defect escape with respect to pre-silicon and first time rights. So to achieve all these things, so validation team in the bootrom, they follow this model. Okay, from the requirement, we identify use system test and unit test requirements. Requirement, system test, and unit test, they feed into to give us a traceability to make sure that we have coverage. At the system test level, we majorly focus upon performance, coverage, fault injection, life cycle based testing, use case testing, regression analysis, and all. At the unit level, we majorly take care about unit test coverages, functional requirements, negative scenarios, and the boundary cases. So all these pillars of validation ensures that we have zero defect bootrom so far. Now let's talk about different environments. So if you look at on the left-hand side, we have emulation, right side we have simulation. Okay, so what is an emulation? So these are, let's say, these are big boxes that we have, which have huge FPGAs inside them. And what we typically do here is our emulation team takes the SOC design and puts that onto this FPGA, and it provides you a silicon kind of environment. From the bootrom perspective, what we do is we develop our code, backdoor load it into this device, and then start executing our test. So once we start executing our test, we identify, okay, is it working the way it is expected to work or not? Similarly, emulation platforms also have certain limitations. these limitations are overcome inside a simulation platform. So a question can come, why emulation and why not simulation? Reason is simple. Simulation is approximately 100 times slower than emulation. So simulations are run on high-end compute servers, which are running the entire SOC cycle by cycle, right? And even still, simulation is so slow that if you start executing Bootrom on simulation, it takes a lot of time. So we make sure the critical components, like the analog portion of the component, is tested inside simulation layers, so that we make sure that it is first time right. Once the silicon is out, the testing typically involves connecting with a debugger onto a target port, connected with a PC, and the tests are executed on that PC or on this device to validate the testing, validate the behavior of the device. Now, how? So when you have to say a typical boot ROM, we run plethora of tests. These things cannot be done with manually. So most of the things are automated. So it starts from a functional specification or a verification plan that comes into play. Based upon the plan, you develop your test cases and the test infrastructure completed. At the end of the construct cycle, you have your test cases as well as infra to test the test cases. You execute these test cases on simulation or on Palladium, get the results, and then you analyze these results. So when we do a sign off, we analyze these results. This can be functional report, negative report, coverage report, and then a decision is taken. Are we good to go or not? If we are not good to go, we identify what needs to be done and we go back into the cycle of testing again. Once we are through, we say we have a good boot ROM for this device to work with, and we are happy to sign it off for tape out. So at the end of the day, I want to summarize what a boot ROM does. Very nutshell, a boot ROM simply loads the application and passes control to it securely for it to boot. And that is what we call it booting. With this, I'll end my presentation and thank everybody. Okay, now let's take the question here. Is there a scope of internship for third-year student? I think you need to talk with the HR for that. What is CAN communication? Okay, so if you so CAN basically stands for Controller Area Network. Okay, a CAN is a widely used bus in your vehicles. So if you look at your typical vehicle, it is all the wire harnesses that you see going around in your vehicle. For example, your multimedia console to your steering control, into your cluster where you see the speedometer and all, lighting, engines. So all these are connected through typically by a CAN. There are other buses also that run into an automotive system. So CAN is basically a backbone in today's automotive world. What an ECU? I think the page has already left, but an ECU is an electronic control unit. So any electronic device which is connected into your system is typically referred to as an ECU in a car. What EOM? I didn't understand what an EOM will mean. It's different this thing for me. Why is simulation better than emulation? Please give an example. Okay, so if you look at emulation, for example, emulation is a pretty fast pretty fast interface with respect to simulation, but simulation has its own upsides. For example, I can use simulation for running my random number generator test. If I have to generate a random number, I cannot do it on an emulation platform. So far, we were not able to do it, right? So simulation is where we are able to run those random number generations. So these are typically the places where simulation is obviously better than an emulation. Likewise, we do a lot of test modes in our code. So those test modes are typically generated in a simulation environment because they are replayed on the tester machine directly. Third example where I can say simulation is better is the analog testing. So let's say we are using a PLL for clocks, right? So your emulations are typically digital platforms. They do not emulate. They do not have PLLs. They do not have the exact analog block in place. They have an analog block model. So if you tell if you are on let's say emulation and you say PLL, hey PLL, switch it to 160 megahertz or 400 megahertz, PLL will start simply giving you a 400 meg clock. But on a real hardware, whatever settings that you are doing for the PLL, they are tested in a simulation environment where the actual sock is available. I hope this answers your question, Akshat. What is the criteria for selection of NAND and NOR flash in NPI with respect to boot ROM? Okay, so I'll answer it a bit differently, Shikha. The criteria for selection is not for boot ROM, it is for the customer application. Okay, that's the first number one. Whether I want to use NAND or NOR, the choice depends upon NAND comes with very high density. Okay, I can have a very high density NAND, MLC NANDs into my system, which takes very less size. But NANDs are prone to ECC error. They are not that robust. Okay. When I'm on an automotive, I will say I may prefer that, okay, let's have a NOR flash on the system because NOR flash, even though they are costly per bit, but they are ultra reliable, right? So since they are being ultra reliable and I want this device to work for 10 years, 15 years at a stretch without any problem, I may choose for a NOR